I want to say thank you for joining in with me today. Thanks for finding my channel. If you would please go ahead and hit the like and the subscribe button so that you find me again. Or this could be the last time that I see you. Or that you see me. Or that you hear me. So let's make sure that you see me again and go ahead and hit the like and the subscribe button. Hit the notification bell if you're into that. And leave me a comment. Let me know what's your next book you'd like me to read. Keep in mind it can't be anything too new. It's got to be kind of a classic. So we're going to read Lassie Come Home, the classic novel. I've got my page queued up already to begin. Just letting YouTube get us going live and make sure my sound is on. Let me know if you have trouble hearing me, and once I get started reading, I'm probably not going to stop much. I know I don't have a phone stand. If I did, I'd just put it on and you can look at me holding the book, but for me to read it and record it and live stream it for you, you just kind of have to be like this for a minute, okay? Alright, you guys ready? Here we go. Lassie Come Home. Not for sale. Everyone in Grinnell Bridge knew Sam Carraclow's Lassie. In fact, you might say that she was the best-known dog in the village, and for 3 reasons. First, because nearly every man in the village agreed that she was the finest collie that they'd ever laid eyes on. This was praise indeed, for Grinnell Bridge is in the county of Yorkshire, and of all places in the world, it is here that the dog is really king. In that bleak part of northern England, the dog seems to thrive as it does nowhere else. The wind and the cold rain sweep over the flat moorlands, making the dogs rich-coated and as sturdy as the people who live there. The people love dogs and are clever at raising them. You can go into any one of the hundreds of small mining villages in this largest of England's counties and see, walking at the heels of humbly clad workmen, dogs of such a fine breed and aristocratic bearing as to arouse the envy of wealthier dog fanciers from other parts of the world. And Grinnell Bridge was like other Yorkshire villages. Its men knew and understood and loved dogs, and there were perfect ones that walked at men's heels. But they agreed that if a finer dog than Sam Carraclaw's tricolor collie had ever been bred in Grinnell Bridge, then it must have been long before they were born. But there was another reason why Lassie was so well known in the village. It was because, as the women said, you can set your clock by her. That had begun many years before, when Lassie was a bright, harum-scarum yearling. One day Sam Carraclow's boy, Joe, had come home bubbling with excitement. "Mother, I come out of school today, and who do you think was waiting for me? Lassie. Now how do you think she knew where I was?" "She must have picked up your scent, Joe. That's all I could figure out." Whatever it was, Lassie was waiting at the school gate the next day, and the next, and the weeks and the months and the years had gone past, and it had always been the same. Women glancing through the windows of the cottages, or shopkeepers standing in the doors on High Street, would see a proud black, white, and gold sable dog go past on a steady trot, and they'd say, "Well, it must be 5 minutes to 4. There goes Lassie." Rain or shine, the dog was always there, waiting for the boy, one of dozens who would come pelting across the concrete playground, but for the dog, the only one who mattered. Always there would be a moment of happy greeting, and then together the boy and the dog would go home. For 4 years it had always been the same. Lassie was a well-loved figure in the daily life of the village. Almost everyone knew her, but most of all the people of Grinnell Bridge were proud of Lassie because she stood for something that they could not have explained readily. It had something to do with their pride, and their pride had something to do with money. Generally, when a man raised an especially fine dog, someday it would stop being a dog, and instead it would become something on 4 legs that was worth money. It was still a dog, of course, but now it was something else too, for a rich man might hear of it, or the alert dealers or kennelmen might see it, and then they would want to buy it, while a rich man may love a dog just as truly as a poor man. There's no difference in them in this. But there is a difference between them in the way they must look at money. For the poor man sits and thinks about how much coal he'll need that winter, and how many pairs of shoes will be necessary, and how much food his children ought to have to keep 'em sturdy, And then he'll go home and say, "Now, I had to do it, so don't plague me. We'll raise another dog some day, and you'll love it just as much as you did this one." That way, many fine dogs have gone from homes in Grinnell Bridge, but not Lassie. Why, the whole village knew that not even the Duke of Rudling had been able to buy Lassie from Sam Carraclough, the very Duke himself, who lived in his great estate a mile beyond the village, and who had his kennels full of fine dogs. For 3 years the Duke had been trying to buy Lassie from Sam Carraclough, and Sam had stood his ground. "It's no use raising your price again, your lordship," he'd say. "It's just that, well, she's not for sale for no price." The village knew all about that. And that was why Lassie meant so much to them. She represented some sort of pride that money had not been able to take away from them. Yet dogs are owned by men, and men are bludgeoned by fate. And sometimes there comes a time in a man's life when fate has beaten him, so that he must bow his head and decide that he must eat his pride so that his family can buy bread. "I never want another dog." The dog was not there. That was all Joe Carraclough knew. That day he had come out of school with the others, and he had gone racing across the yard in a rush of gladness that you see at all schools all the world over when the lessons are over for the day, almost automatically, by habit ingrained through hundreds of days. He had gone to the gate, where Lassie always waited, and she was not there. Joe Carraclough stood, a sturdy, pleasant-faced boy, trying to reason it out. The broad forehead above his brown eyes became wrinkled. At first he found himself unable to realize what his senses told him could be true. He looked up and down the street. Perhaps Lassie was late? He knew that he could not be the reason. Animals are not like human beings. Human beings have watches and clocks, and yet they're always finding themselves 5 minutes behind time. Animals don't need a machine to tell time. There's something inside them that is more accurate than a clock. It is a time sense, and it never fails them. They know surely and truly exactly when it is time to take part in some well-established routine of life. Joe Carraclough knew that. He'd often talked it over with his father and asked him how it was that Lassie knew when it was time to start for the school gate. Lassie could not be late. Joe Carraclough stood in the early summer sunshine, thinking about this. Suddenly a flash came into his mind. Perhaps she'd been run over. Even as this thought brought panic to him, he was dismissing it. Lassie was far too well trained to wander carelessly into the street. She always moved daintily and surely along the pavement of the village. Then, too, there was as very little traffic of any kind in Grinnell Bridge. The main motor road went along the valley by the river a mile away. Only a small road came up to the village, and that became merely a narrow footpath farther along when it reached the flat moorland. Perhaps someone had stolen Lassie. Yes, this could hardly be true. No stranger could so much as put a hand on Lassie, unless one of the Carracloughs were standing there to order her to submit to it. And moreover, she was far too well known for miles around Grinnell Bridge for anyone to dare steal her. But where could she be? Joe Carraclough solved his problem as hundreds of thousands of boys solve their problems the world over. He ran straight home to tell his mother. Down the main street he went, racing as fast as he could without pausing. He went past the shops on High Street. He went through the village to the little lane, going up the hillside, up the lane, through the gate, along a garden path, and then through the cottage door, and he cried out, "Mother! Mother, something's happened to Lassie. She didn't meet me." And as soon as he said it, Joe Carraclough knew that there was something wrong. No one in the cottage jumped up and asked him what the matter was, and no one seemed afraid that something dire had happened to their fine dog. Joe noticed that. He stood with his back to the door, waiting. His mother stood with her eyes down toward the table where she was setting out the tea-time meal, and for a second she was still. Then she looked at her husband. Joe's father was sitting on a low stool before the fire, his head turned toward his son. Slowly, without speaking, he turned back to the fire, and he stared into it intently. "What is it, Mother?" Joe cried out suddenly. "What's wrong?" Miss Carraclough set a plate on the table slowly, and then she spoke. Well, somebody's got to tell him, she said, as if to the air. Her husband made no move. She turned her head toward her son. You might as well know it right off, Joe. Lassie won't be waiting at school for you no more, and there's no use crying about it. Why not? But what happened to her? Miss Carraclough went to the fireplace, and she set the kettle over it, and she spoke without turning. Because she sold, that's why not. Sold! The boy echoed, his voice high. Sold? What did you sell her for, Lassie? What did you sell her for? His mother turned angrily. Now she's sold and gone and done with, so don't you ask me any more questions. That won't change it. She's gone. So that's that. And let's say no more about it. But Mother! The boy's cry rang out high and puzzled. His mother interrupted him. Now no more. You come have your tea. Come on. Sit you down. Obediently, the boy went to his place at the table, and the woman turned to the man at the fireplace. Come on, Sam, and eat. Lord knows it's poor enough stuff to set out for a tea. The woman grew quiet as her husband rose with an angry suddenness. And then, without speaking a word, he strode to the door. He took his cap from a peg and he went out, and the door slammed behind him. And for a moment after, the cottage was silent, and the woman's voice rose, scolding in tone. Now see what you done. Got the father all angry. I suppose you're happy now. Wearily she sat in her chair and stared at the table. For a long time the cottage was just silent. Joe knew it was unfair of his mother to blame him for what was happening. Yet he knew, too, that it was his mother's way of covering up her own hurt. It was exactly the same as her scolding. That was the way with the people in these parts. They were rough, stubborn people. They were used to living a rough, hard life. And when anything happened that touched their emotions, they covered it up. They covered up their feelings. The woman scolded and chattered to hide their hurts. They didn't mean anything by it. After it was over, come on, Joe, eat up. His mother's voice was soft and patient now. The boy stared at his plate, unmoving. Come on, Joe, eat your bread and butter. Look, nice new bread. I just baked it today. Don't you want it? The boy bent his head lower. I don't want any, he said in a whisper. Oh, dogs, dogs, dogs! His mother flared. Her voice rose in anger again. All this trouble over one dog. Well, if you ask me, I'm glad Lassie's gone, and that I am. As much trouble to take care of as a child, and now she's gone and it's done with, and I'm glad. I'm glad. Mrs. Carraclough shook her plump self and sniffed. And then she took her handkerchief from her apron pocket and blew her nose. And finally she looked at her son, still sitting, unmoving. And she shook her head sadly and spoke. And again her voice was patient and kind. Joe, come here, she said. The boy rose and stood by his mother. She put her plump arm around him and spoke with her head turned to the fire. Look, Joe, you're getting to be a big lad now, and you can understand, you see. Well, you know things aren't going so well for us these days. You know how it is. And we've got to have food on the table. We've got to pay our rent. And Lassie was worth a lot of money, and, well, we couldn't afford to keep her, that's all. Now, these are poor times. And you just mustn't upset the father. He's always worried enough as it is, and, well, that's all. She's gone. Young Joe Carraclough stood by his mother in the cottage. He did understand. Even a boy of 12 years in Grinnell Bridge knew what poor times were. For years and for as long as children could remember, the fathers had worked in the Wellington pit beyond the village. They had gone on shift and off shift, carrying their snap boxes of food and their collier's lanterns, and they had worked at bringing up the rich coal. Then times had become poor, and the pit went on slack time, and the men earned less. And sometimes the work picked up, and the men had gone on full time, and then everyone was glad. It did not mean luxurious living for them, for in the coal mining villages, people lived a hard life at best, and it was a life of courage and family unity at least, and if the food that was set on the table was plain, well, at least there was enough of it to go around. Only a few months ago the pit had closed down altogether. The big wheel at the top of the shaft spun no more. The men no longer flowed in a stream to the pit yard at the shift changes. Instead, they signed on at the labor exchange, and they stood on the corner by the exchange and waited for work. But no work came. It seemed that they were in what the newspaper called the stricken areas, the sections of the country from which all the industry had gone. Whole villages of people were out of work now. There was no way of earning a living. The government gave the people a dole, a weekly sum of money, so that they could just stay alive. Joe knew this, and he had heard people talking in the village. He'd seen the men at the labor exchange. He knew his father no longer went to work. He knew, too, that his father and mother never spoke of it before him, that in their rough and kind way they had tried to keep the burdens of living from bearing also on his young shoulders. Though his brain told him these things, his heart still cried for Lassie, but he silenced it. He stood steadily, and then he asked one question. "Couldn't we buy her back some day, Mother?" "Well, now, Joe, she's a very valuable dog, and she's worth too much for us. But we'll get another dog some day. Just wait. Times might pick up, and then we'll go get another pup. Wouldn't you like that?" Joe Caraclaw bent his head, and he shook it slowly. His voice was only a whisper. "I don't ever want another dog. Never. I only want Lassie." An evil-tempered old man. The Duke of Rutland stood by the rhododendron hedge and glared about him, and his voice lifted again. "Hines!" he roared. "Hines! Where's that chap got to? Hines!" At that moment, with his face red and his shock of white hair disordered, the Duke looked like what he was reputed to be, the worst-tempered old man in all the 3 ridings of Yorkshire. Whether or not he deserved this reputation, it would seem sufficient to say that his words and actions earned it. Perhaps it was partly due to the fact that the Duke was exceedingly deaf, carrying a big black thorn stick, which he always waved wildly in the air in order to give emphasis to his already too emphatic words. And finally his bad temper came from his impatience with the world. For the Duke had one firm belief, which was that the world was going, as he phrased it, to pot. Nothing ever was as good as the days it had been when he was a young man. Horses could not run so fast, and young men were not so brave and dashing, and women were not so pretty. Flowers did not grow so well, and as for dogs, if there were any decent ones left in the world, it was because they were in his own kennel. The people couldn't speak the king's English these days, and as they could when he was a young man, according to the Duke. He was firmly of the opinion that the reason he could not hear properly was not because he was deaf, but because people nowadays had gone into the pernicious habit of mumbling and snipping their words instead of saying them plainly as they did when he was a young man. And as for the younger generation, the Duke could and often would lecture for hours on the worthlessness of everyone born in the 20th century. This last was curious, for all of his relatives, the only one the Duke could stand, and who could stand the Duke it seemed, was the youngest member of his family, his 12-year-old granddaughter Priscilla. It was Priscilla who came to his rescue now, as he stood waving his stick and shouting beside the rhododendron hedge. Dodging a wild swish of the stick, she reached over and pulled the pocket of his tweed Norfolk coat. He turned with bristling mustaches. "Oh, it's you," he roared. "It's a wonder somebody finally came. Don't know what the world's coming to. Servants no good. Everybody too deaf to hear. Country's going to pot." "Nonsense," said Priscilla. She was indeed a very self-contained and composed young lady. From her continued association with her grandfather, she had grown to consider both of them as equals, either as old children or as very young grown-ups. "What's that?" the Duke roared, looking down at her. "Speak up now, don't mumble." Priscilla pulled his head down so that she could speak directly into his ear. "I said nonsense," she shouted. "Nonsense," roared the Duke. He stared down at her and then broke out into a roar of laughter. He had a curious way of reasoning about Priscilla. He was convinced that if Priscilla had pluck enough to answer him back, she must have inherited it from him. So he felt in a much better temper as he looked down at his granddaughter. He flourished his long white mustaches, which were grander and finer than the kind of mustaches that men manage to grow these days. "Oh, glad you turned up," the Duke boomed. "I want you to see a new dog. She's marvelous, beautiful, the finest collie I ever laid my eyes on." "She isn't so good as the ones they had in the old days, is she?" Priscilla asked, "Don't mumble," roared the Duke. "Can't hear a word you say." He had heard perfectly well, but he had decided to ignore it. "Knew I'd get her," the Duke continued. "Been after her for 3 years now." 3 years, echoed Priscilla. She knew that that was what her grandfather wanted her to say. "Yes, 3 years, and he thought he'd get the better of me, but he didn't. Offered him £10 for her 3 years ago, and he wouldn't sell her. Came up to 12 the year after that, and he wouldn't sell her. Last year I offered him £15. I told him it was the rock bottom limit, and I meant it. But he didn't think so. Held out for another 6 months. And then he sent a word last week that he'd take it." The Duke seemed pleased with himself, but Priscilla shook her head. "How do you know she isn't coped?" This was a natural question to ask, for in truth must be told, Yorkshiremen are not only known about raising dogs, but they're sometimes alleged to carry their knowledge too far. Often they exercise devious secret arts in hiding faults in a dog, perhaps treating a crooked ear or a faulty tail carriage so that this drawback is absolutely imperceptible until much later when the less known purchaser has paid for the dog and taken it home. And these tricks and treatments are known as coping. In the buying and selling of dogs and of horses, the unwritten rule is caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. But the Duke only roared louder when he heard Priscilla's question. "How do I know if she's coped?" "Because I'm a Yorkshireman too. I know as many tricks as they do, and a few more to boot. I'll warrant you that. No, this is a straight dog. And besides, I got her from what's-his-name Caraclow. Know him too well. He wouldn't dare try anything like that on me. Indeed not." We're going to take a break there, you guys. If you want to hear more of Lassie Come Home, like and subscribe to the channel.